Elizabeth Whitmore did not scream when she walked into that library and saw the papers on the silver tray. She did not faint. She did not reach for the chair behind her, though her knees went hollow and the room tilted hard. She simply stood there, looked at her husband standing beside another woman, and did the one thing nobody in that house expected. She smiled. If this story moves something in you, subscribe and follow every part to the end, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Virginia had been baking under a relentless summer sky for 3 weeks running when Elizabeth Whitmore came home early from the market. She hadn't planned to come back before noon. She'd meant to stop at the Caldwell farm, check on the seed delivery, settle an argument between the foreman and the mill supplier that had been festering since Tuesday. But the heat had been something vicious that morning, the kind that pressed down on a person's shoulders like two rough hands, and she'd finished faster than expected. And she'd told herself she deserved one quiet hour in the cool of the manor before the afternoon brought its usual chaos. She should have known better. She'd been telling herself small kind lies like that for 6 years. The front door of Harrington Manor stood open when she came up the drive. That was the first thing she noticed. Thomas, the head footman, always kept it shut in summer to hold the cool air inside. Thomas was nowhere in sight. Neither was Margaret, the housemaid, who typically appeared at the sound of horse hooves on gravel. The silence wasn't peaceful. It had the quality of held breath. Elizabeth handed her horse off to the stable boy, a thin-legged kid named Amos, who looked at the ground and said nothing, which was another thing that wasn't right, because Amos always asked if she'd seen anything interesting in town. She walked up the front steps. Through the open door, she could hear voices from the library. Low, careful voices arranged in the particular way people arrange their voices when they are rehearsing something. Not arguing. Rehearsing. She knew Alexander's voice. 6 years of marriage gave a woman that at least. She also knew the other voice. It was softer, younger, and it belonged to Charlotte Monroe, whose family estate sat 2 ridges east of Harrington Land, and whose blue silk gown Elizabeth had once stood outside a shop window, admiring a full winter ago, before she understood why her husband had commissioned it. Elizabeth did not slow her steps. She was 31 years old, and she had not survived 6 years inside this marriage by being the kind of woman who slowed her steps. She pushed open the library door. The room came to her in pieces, the low fire burning despite the summer heat, the tall windows with their curtains half drawn. Alexander standing behind his great oak desk with his hands clasped at his back, the way he stood when he had decided something and wanted the deciding to look distinguished. Charlotte positioned just slightly to his left in that blue gown, like a woman who had practiced her placement, and between all of it on the corner of the desk, sitting on the silver tray that normally held Alexander's morning correspondence, 3 items. A fountain pen with the cap removed. A sealed document bearing the mark of Harrington's solicitor. And Elizabeth's marriage reduced to ink and paper, waiting for her signature. Nobody moved. Charlotte's chin lifted half an inch. Alexander's jaw tightened, but his eyes held steady, because Alexander Harrington had spent 37 years perfecting the expression of a man who believed his decisions were foregone conclusions. And Elizabeth stood in the doorway of her own home. The home she had managed, the land she had quietly saved, the household she had held together through drought and debt, and 3 consecutive years of the kind of financial bleeding that would have destroyed a lesser estate. And she looked at those papers, and something inside her went completely, utterly still. Not broken. Still. The way a river goes still before it changes course. Then she smiled. Alexander's composure slipped just barely, just at the edges. He'd expected tears. He'd prepared for tears. Charlotte had prepared for tears. The whole arranged scene had been constructed around the architecture of a woman's tears, her distress, her pleading, her desperate grasping at the remnants of a life being taken from her. He had not prepared for this. "Elizabeth," he said, and his voice had the careful calm of a man controlling something larger than calm. "I believe this conversation is long overdue." "Do you?" Elizabeth said. It wasn't a question. She walked into the room slowly, the way she walked everywhere. Not because she was timid, but because she had learned long ago that a woman who moved without hurry was a woman who could not be rattled, and Elizabeth Whitmore had decided at 17 years old that she would never again in her life be rattled by a man who mistook her patience for weakness. She stopped in front of the desk. She looked at the papers. Then she looked at Charlotte, who was watching her with eyes that had been arranged to show nothing but mild dignity. Though underneath that arrangement, Elizabeth could see the faintest current of uncertainty beginning to move. "Charlotte," Elizabeth said, not unkindly. "You might want to sit down." Charlotte's nostrils flared. "I beg your pardon." "It'll make sense in a moment." Alexander stepped forward, his voice dropping into the lower register he used for statements of consequence. "Elizabeth, I understand this is difficult." "Do you understand it?" she said. "Because I'm not certain you understand a great deal of what happens in this house, Alexander, so I'd be careful about claiming comprehension." His eyes narrowed. "This is not the time for what?" She tilted her head. "For honesty. We've been married 6 years. I think we're past due." Charlotte made a small sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a scoff, something in between, and Elizabeth turned to look at her with such directness that the sound stopped. "You came here today expecting me to fall apart," Elizabeth said. "Both of you did. That's why you arranged it like this, the desk, the papers on the tray, the two of you standing together. You wanted the picture to be unmistakable. You wanted me to walk in and immediately understand that I had already lost." She reached out and touched the corner of the document with one finger, the way you might touch something that used to belong to you and no longer does, with recognition rather than grief. "It's actually quite well staged," she said. "I'll give you that." "Elizabeth." Alexander's voice had gone flat. "This is not a theatrical performance. This is the end of our marriage." "Yes," she said. "It is." She pulled her hand back from the papers. "But it is not," she said, "the end of this conversation." She pulled the chair from the side of the desk, not the visitor's chair, but Alexander's own chair, the one he sat in when he conducted business, the one that had always been understood to be his, and she sat down in it with the ease of a woman who had been occupying rooms far larger than the ones she was given credit for. Alexander's face went through several things in quick succession. She watched them pass like weather. "I'm going to tell you what I know," Elizabeth said. "And then you're going to tell me whether you still want me to sign those papers. Because I think once you hear what I know, you may want to reconsider the terms." Charlotte looked at Alexander. Alexander looked at Elizabeth. "What?" he said carefully. "Do you think you know?" Elizabeth folded her hands in her lap. "I know about the debt to Mercer Holdings," she said. The color left Alexander's face so quickly it was almost remarkable. $34,000. Elizabeth continued, her voice as even as Riverstone. "Borrowed against the eastern tobacco fields 18 months ago, when the crop yield came up short for the second year running. I know the note comes due in October. I know you've been trying to renegotiate since March, and I know it hasn't been going well because I've seen the letters. Not because I went looking for them, but because you leave things in the wrong desk drawer when you're anxious, and I manage this household, which means I am in every room in this house, Alexander, every single room, and there is not a single corner of this estate that I do not know better than you do." Charlotte had sat down. Not in the chair Elizabeth had suggested, but in the small chair against the wall, the one the servants used when they waited for instruction. She'd sat down without seeming to realize she'd done it. "I also know," Elizabeth said, "about the loan from your brother Edmund, which he gave you in private and which you have not told your mother about, because your mother gave Edmund that money to invest in the Pendleton mill, and if she discovered you'd used it to cover your gambling losses from the winter of 1815, she would—" "Stop!" Alexander's voice came out sharp and small like a stone breaking. "I'm not finished." "Elizabeth, the mill contract," she said. "The one you nearly lost in February because your foreman Graves has been skimming from the supply orders for 2 years. I caught it in the account books. I renegotiated directly with the Pendleton family. I told them there had been a bookkeeping error. They were gracious about it. I didn't tell you because I handled it, and because by February you were all ready." She paused, and something crossed her face. Not pain exactly, but the acknowledgement of what pain had left behind, otherwise engaged. The fire cracked in the grate. Outside, through the half-drawn curtains, the summer heat pressed white and indifferent against the glass. "You saved the mill contract," Alexander said. He didn't sound like himself. He sounded like a man who had just discovered the floor beneath him was not where he thought it was. "I've saved 11 things in this household in the last 3 years," Elizabeth said calmly. I can list them if you'd like. I kept notes. Charlotte looked between them, like a woman who had stepped into a room expecting a small fire and discovered instead a structure burning from the foundations. Alexander, Charlotte said, and her voice had lost the careful softness she'd brought in with her. What is she talking about? She's talking about the estate, Elizabeth said. His estate. The one he was going to sign over clean to himself in a divorce settlement that would leave me with my personal effects and whatever my father's will specified, which, and I assume your solicitor told you this, Alexander, because he is not entirely incompetent, which specifies that upon dissolution of my marriage, all properties held in my name revert fully to me, including the 300 acres my father purchased in my name specifically, and which currently produce the best tobacco yield on this side of the Shenandoah Valley. Alexander sat down on the edge of the desk. It wasn't graceful. It was the sitting down of a man whose legs had made a decision independent of his dignity. That land, Elizabeth said, is what the eastern crop has been borrowing against in the good years. The soil composition on your father's original parcel has been declining for 8 seasons. I have the assessments. Your tobacco, without my 300 acres in rotation, without my wells, without the irrigation channels I had dug the summer you were in Philadelphia for 6 weeks. She stopped. You told me you were meeting with legislators. Silence. You were with her, Elizabeth said. Not an accusation, a completion. Charlotte was looking at her hands. Yes, Alexander said very quietly. I knew that too, Elizabeth said. I just wanted you to say it. She rose from his chair. She straightened her dress, plain cotton, nothing like the blue silk, practical and clean, and exactly what a woman wore when she expected a full day of actual work, and she walked to the window and stood looking out at the land she knew better than its owner did. I'm not going to cry, she said. I want to be clear about that. Not because I'm not hurt, I am. You do not spend 6 years of your life building something with a person without being hurt when they decide to trade it away. But I'm not going to cry in front of you, and I'm not going to cry in front of her, and I'm not going to sign those papers today. Elizabeth, I'm not finished. She didn't turn around. If you want a divorce, Alexander, you are going to need to negotiate for one. Because what your solicitor drew up is not a settlement, it's a confiscation, and I am not a woman who will be confiscated. She heard him push off the desk. She heard him cross the room toward her, and she kept her eyes on the fields until he stopped a few feet behind her, and she could feel him there, the way you feel a fire when you have your back to it. I didn't know, he said. About the contract, about the accounts. No, she said. You didn't. Why didn't you tell me? She turned around then and looked at him. Really looked at him the way she hadn't let herself look at him in probably 2 years. Because there is a point in a dying thing where looking at it clearly only makes the dying faster. And she had been trying. God help her. She had been trying to keep this alive longer than it deserved. Because every time I tried to speak to you about the estate, she said, you reminded me that your grandfather had built Harrington Manor, and your father had grown the fields, and that the financial matters were yours to manage. You thanked me for managing the household. You meant the linens, Alexander, the kitchen gardens, the servants' schedules. You thought that's what I was doing. He was quiet. I was managing your survival, she said. And you never once asked. Charlotte rose from her chair against the wall. Her voice had changed, the society softness had worn off, and underneath it was something younger and a great deal less certain. Alexander, she said, you told me the estate was profitable. He didn't answer her. You told me the Harrington lands were among the finest in the state, that you were... He told you what he needed to tell you. Elizabeth said, not cruelly, but without softness either, to make you feel secure in a future he was offering you. I don't know whether he knew he was lying, or whether he simply didn't know the truth well enough to lie accurately. I suspect the latter. Charlotte's face did something complicated. He said I would be mistress of this estate. You might yet be, Elizabeth said, if he can hold on to it without me, which he is going to find rather more difficult than he estimated. She picked up her gloves from the side table where she'd set them when she came in. I'm going to go change out of my riding clothes. I am going to take my dinner in my rooms tonight. And tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, I would like to meet with you, Alexander, and with your solicitor, and I will bring my own documents, and we will discuss rationally, like two adults who made a mistake and need to find their way out of it without destroying each other, what an equitable arrangement might actually look like." She walked toward the door. "And Charlotte," she said, pausing without turning her voice, dropping just slightly into something that wasn't gentle and wasn't cruel, but was simply the truth spoken plainly. "Whatever you were told about this place, whatever promises were made, you should look carefully at the account books before you make any permanent decisions. I'll leave my copies in the front parlor. You're welcome to review them." She opened the library door. Behind her, she could hear Charlotte beginning to say something to Alexander, her voice low and tight with the beginning of something that would take hours to finish, and Alexander's voice starting up in response, and the particular quality of silence that descends on a room when two people who've been constructing a shared illusion discover simultaneously that the foundation was never there. Elizabeth closed the door behind her. In the hallway, Margaret the housemaid stood pressed against the wall with her eyes very wide, and Thomas the footman was halfway down the corridor, pretending to arrange a flower vase that was already arranged. Elizabeth looked at them both. "Margaret," she said, "would you have cook send supper to my rooms at 7? Something cold given the heat." She pulled on her gloves. "And Thomas, next time shut the front door." "Yes, ma'am," they said nearly in unison. She walked up the stairs. She did not hurry. At the top of the landing, she stopped, one hand on the banister, and looked out the tall window that faced east across the fields. Her fields, her father's gift to her, the 300 acres that had quietly held this whole failing enterprise together, while the Duke of Harrington looked past her at everything he thought he was owed. Her chest ached. It ached the way things ache when you stop holding them so tightly, when you finally let yourself feel the weight you've been carrying without naming it. She pressed her hand flat against the window glass. It was warm from the summer sun, solid and real beneath her palm. She had built something here. Something no one had seen because no one had thought to look. And now they were looking, and the question, the one that would keep her awake tonight, regardless of her composure, regardless of everything she'd said in that library, with such precision, the question was whether what she had built was enough. Whether she was enough. She pulled her hand from the glass. She straightened her spine, and she went to change her clothes because there was work yet to be done, and Elizabeth Whitmore had never in her life let grief arrive before the work was finished. Down in the library, the divorce papers sat untouched on the silver tray. The fountain pen lay beside them, its cap still off, and Alexander Harrington stood at the window his wife had just vacated, looking out at 300 acres he had never once thought to value, while the woman he'd brought home to replace her asked him in a voice gone very quiet and very cold, exactly how much of what he'd told her was true. He did not have a good answer. I was beginning to suspect he hadn't had one in years. The night came in slow and heavy over Harrington Manor, the kind of summer night that pressed the heat right down into the floorboards and made the air feel thick enough to drink. Elizabeth ate her cold supper alone in her rooms, sliced chicken bread, a cup of water, and she did not taste any of it. She sat at the small writing desk her father had given her when she married, the one she'd had carried up to her private rooms because Alexander's great mahogany study desk had never felt like a place she was invited, only a place she was occasionally permitted. She opened the bottom drawer, the locked one, and she set the key on the blotter, and she sat there for a long moment, looking at the stack of papers inside before she touched them. 6 years of paper. Account ledgers she'd copied in her own hand because she hadn't trusted the estate's copies. Letters she'd written and received that Alexander had never known about, not because she'd been dishonest, but because he'd never asked, and she had long since learned that offering information to a man who believed he already had all of it only produced irritation. Receipts from the Pendleton Mill negotiation. Soil assessments from the eastern fields. A survey of her 300 acres that she'd commissioned herself 2 summers ago from a land assessor out of Richmond, a man named Colby, who'd been recommended by her father's old business partner because Elizabeth had wanted to know precisely on paper, in numbers, exactly what she was sitting on. She spread the papers across the desk in the order she'd need them tomorrow morning. Then she picked up her pen and she wrote. She wrote for 2 hours. Names, figures, dates, the sequence of decisions that had kept the Harrington estate solvent through 3 difficult years. She wrote it not to impress Alexander and not to wound him. She wrote it because she ordered in her own mind before morning, because she was going to walk into that meeting and she was going to be precise, and precision required clarity. And clarity required the courage to look at things as they actually were, rather than as she'd wished them to be. She was still writing when she heard the knock at her door. Not Alexander's knock. She'd have recognized that 3 sharp raps, impatient the knock of a man who considered knocking a courtesy he was extending. This was a softer knock, uncertain, which meant it was either a servant or someone who had spent the last several hours in the library losing the ground beneath their feet. "Come in," Elizabeth said. The door opened and Charlotte Monroe stepped inside. She'd changed out of the blue silk. She was wearing a simple day dress now, cream-colored, and without the careful arrangement of the afternoon, she looked younger and considerably less composed. Her dark hair had been partially unpinned, though whether from agitation or the heat was hard to say, and her eyes, which Elizabeth had previously seen only narrowed with the particular confidence of a woman who believed she was winning, were carrying something different now. Not guilt quite, but close to it. Close enough that Elizabeth set down her pen. "I don't think I should be here," Charlotte said. "I nearly didn't come." "But you did." Charlotte's mouth pressed together. "I read some of the account books, the copies you left in the parlor." "I left all of them. I read some." Charlotte moved a little further into the room, not all the way, keeping herself near the door, the way a person keeps themselves near the exit when they aren't certain of their welcome. The tobacco yield records from 1814 and 1815. The notation about the mill contract. There's a column in the Eastern Fields ledger marked with your initials. "EHW," Elizabeth said. "Yes, that's where I logged the changes I made to the irrigation rotation. He told me—" Charlotte stopped. Started again. "Alexander told me the estate had been in difficulty years ago, but that he had restored it himself. He made it sound as though there had been a period of mismanagement under the previous steward, and that he had personally—" "He believed that," Elizabeth said. "Not defending him, just accurate. Or he told himself he believed it. There's a difference, though. I'm not certain Alexander has ever found it." Charlotte looked at her for a long, strange moment. "You're not what I expected." "No," Elizabeth said. "I imagine I'm not. I expected you to scream at me." "Would that have helped either of us?" Charlotte didn't answer. She looked at the papers spread across the desk, and something moved across her face. Not calculation, something more uncomfortable than calculation. Something that looked like the beginning of an honest reckoning. "I want you to know that she started, and then she pressed her lips together and tried again. "I did not come here today believing you would simply disappear. I'm not. I did not come here simply to take something from another woman." "Then why did you come?" The question sat there between them, plain and without mercy, and Charlotte met it, the way a person meets something they've been avoiding, with the particular stillness of someone who has run out of room to move. "He made it sound simple," she said finally. "He said the marriage had been dead for years. He said you were unhappy too. He said there would be a clean settlement, that it would be handled with consideration." She stopped. "He said you'd be provided for." "He said I'd be provided for," Elizabeth repeated very quietly. Charlotte heard what was underneath that. Her chin dipped slightly. "I have 300 acres of land in my own name," Elizabeth said. "I have managed this estate through drought debt, 2 failed harvests, and a mill contract dispute that would have cost the Harrington family its primary business relationship. I have done all of this without a title, without public acknowledgement, and without my husband ever once asking how any of it was accomplished. And he told you I would be provided for." Charlotte said nothing. "What else did he tell you?" Elizabeth asked. "About money, about the estate's current position." Charlotte was quiet for long enough that Elizabeth began to think she wouldn't answer. Then she said, "He told me the estate generated $12,000 a year." Elizabeth looked at her steadily. "That is not a correct figure," she said. Charlotte's jaw tightened. "How much is correct? At full production, with my land in rotation and the mill contract intact, the estate can generate close to that. Without my land," Elizabeth said, "which reverts to me upon dissolution of this marriage, without the irrigation improvements, without the mill relationship. I established the Eastern Fields alone will not sustain that number, particularly not with the Mercer Holdings debt coming due in October." Charlotte was very still. "What debt?" It wasn't a question the way the others had been. It was flatter, harder, the words of someone who had felt the floor tilt and was now standing very carefully. $34,000, Elizabeth said. Borrowed against the eastern fields 18 months ago. The color in Charlotte's face did something quiet and dramatic. He didn't tell you, Elizabeth said. No, he wouldn't have, Elizabeth said, and there was something in her voice, not satisfaction. She wasn't a woman who found satisfaction in Charlotte's distress, but something like the tiredness of a person who has been carrying a truth for a very long time and has finally been allowed to set it down. He wouldn't have told you because he needed you to believe in the picture he was painting, the same way he needed me to believe in it 6 years ago. Charlotte sat down then on the wooden chair beside the door without being invited and without apology, the way a person sits down when their legs have decided the matter independently. He asked me 6 months ago to speak to my uncle about an investment opportunity. My uncle has significant capital. He's been looking to expand his land holdings west of the valley. Elizabeth looked at her carefully. He asked you to do this, Elizabeth said, in the context of the two of you and what your future together might look like. Yes. And your uncle, did he express interest? Charlotte looked up at her with an expression Elizabeth hadn't seen on her face before. Raw. Undefended. The expression of a young woman who had been walking confidently through a room and had just discovered the room was a stage set. My uncle met with Alexander in April. I arranged the introduction. I thought I was helping build something. Our future. She stopped. How much of my uncle's investment would go toward the Mercer debt? I don't know, Elizabeth said honestly. I didn't know about your uncle until this moment, but if I were to guess, nearly all of it. Charlotte put her hands in her lap and looked at them. The fire in Elizabeth's small grate had burned low. The summer night pressed at the windows. Somewhere outside, one of the horses was moving in the paddock, and the sound of it, quiet and ordinary, came through the glass, like something from a world that was simply unmysteriously itself, unlike the one currently occupying this room. I'm not asking for your pity, Charlotte said. Her voice had come back, not the careful social voice, but something more direct and considerably less comfortable with itself. And I'm not going to pretend I don't deserve some portion of what's happening. I knew he was married. I told myself things that I knew were convenient, and I told myself them anyway, because I wanted what he was offering. She looked up. But I want you to know that I did not know about the debt. I did not know about your land. I did not know what you had done for this estate. She paused. I don't think he intended to tell me. No, Elizabeth said. He didn't. He would have married me, Charlotte said slowly, and I would have eventually discovered that the estate I thought I was stepping into was half built on a foundation that was walking out the door with you. Yes, Elizabeth said. That is approximately correct. Charlotte looked at her for a long moment. Then she said something Elizabeth hadn't expected. What are you going to do? Elizabeth picked up her pen. I'm going to go to sleep, she said. And tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, I'm going to sit across a desk from your solicitor and mine, and I'm going to negotiate in complete sentences with documented evidence. And then I'm going to see what happens. And if he won't negotiate honestly, then I will pursue the matter through the courts, Elizabeth said simply. And every piece of documentation I have, including the evidence of how this estate has been sustained, will become part of the public record, which will not be comfortable for anyone. Charlotte stood. She smoothed her dress, and for a moment she looked very young, 27, which was 4 years younger than Elizabeth, and Elizabeth found herself thinking that Charlotte Monroe was not a villain. She was something more ordinary and more sad than a villain. She was a young woman who had believed a man's version of the world because it had suited her to believe it, and was now discovering in a small upstairs room in the middle of a summer night that the world had a different version of itself that no one had shown her. For what it's worth, Charlotte said at the door, I don't think you should sign those papers. I know, Elizabeth said. Do you need me to? Is there anything? Charlotte stopped. The offer was unformed, incomplete, the beginning of something she didn't quite know how to finish. Get some sleep, Elizabeth said, not unkindly. And tomorrow when you speak to your uncle, tell him the truth about what you know. You'll feel better for it, and he'll need the information. Charlotte nodded once and left. Elizabeth listened to her footsteps fade down the hallway. Then she turned back to her papers and picked up where she'd left off. She wrote for another hour. At 6:30 in the morning, before the household was properly awake, Alexander came to her door. He knocked the way she'd known he would, 3 raps, but slower than usual, which was the only outward sign that last night had stripped something from him that he hadn't yet replaced. She heard it, and she set her coffee cup down, and she went to the door and opened it. He was already dressed. He looked like a man who had not slept, wearing the clothes of a man who wanted people to think he had. His jaw was shaved, his coat was straight, his hair was combed, and only the particular quality behind his eyes, a flatness, a searching, like a man trying to find his footing in a room where the furniture has been rearranged in the dark, gave him away. "May I come in?" he said. "The meeting isn't until 9. "I know," he paused. "May I come in anyway?" She stepped aside. He came into her sitting room and stood in the middle of it with his hands at his sides, not clasped behind his back, not resting easy, just hanging there. And she realized she'd almost never seen him stand that way, without the posture of authority. It made him look more like a person, and less like a position, which was unsettling in ways she hadn't fully anticipated. "I wanted to talk to you before Caldwell arrives," he said. Caldwell was his solicitor. Before it becomes formal. "All right. You said last night." He stopped and seemed to make a decision about something and started differently. "I didn't know," he said. "About the mill contract. About the irrigation. About what you'd been—" He stopped again. "I know you didn't know," Elizabeth said. "That's not—" He turned away from her slightly, and then turned back, and she could see him working through something, some internal argument that hadn't yet produced its conclusion. "I'm not here to argue about who knew what. I'm here because I want—" He stopped. His jaw tightened. "I want to understand how long." "How long what?" "How long this has been the reality," he said. "The estate, the accounts. How long you have been, how long things have actually been what they apparently actually are." Elizabeth looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Pour yourself some coffee. There's a cup on the sideboard." He did. Which surprised her. She'd half expected him to decline on principle, because the instruction had come from her, and Alexander had always had a complicated relationship with receiving instruction from his wife. But he poured the coffee, and he stood holding it, and he waited. "The eastern fields began showing yield decline in the summer of 1813, she said. "Your harvest that fall was down 14%. You told your steward it was the weather. He agreed with you because stewards generally agree with their employers about unpleasant things. I disagreed with both of you privately, and I commissioned an assessment from a land reader out of Charlottesville, who told me the soil was fatigued from continuous cultivation and needed to be rested and rotated. I was never told about an assessment." "You were told about it," Elizabeth said steadily. "You were told at dinner in October of 1813. You said the man was a charlatan, and that your father's methods had worked for 30 years, and there was no reason to change them." Alexander was quiet. "I implemented the rotation anyway," Elizabeth said, "on my own land which I managed independently, and the following year I made arrangements with your foreman without telling you, because I had already learned how those conversations ended, to extend the rotation to the western sections of the estate land. I framed it as a trial. He agreed. The yield recovered by 11% in 1814. Graves agreed to this. Graves is a practical man, Elizabeth said. He cared about results. He didn't much care who instructed him, as long as the instruction was sensible and came with clear reasoning and didn't require him to explain himself to you." Alexander sat down in the armchair across from her writing desk. He sat down the way he'd been sitting down since last night, not the deliberate settling of a man choosing to be comfortable, but the descent of a man whose bones had stopped cooperating. "The Mercer debt," he said. "Yes. I intended to resolve that through Charlotte's uncle," Elizabeth said. "I know. Charlotte told me." Something moved across his face. Surprise, or the successor to surprise, the stripped-down acknowledgement of a person who has discovered there are no private corners left. "She came to see you." "Last night. She read the account books I left in the parlor." "What did she—" "She asked questions," Elizabeth said. "Honest ones. I answered them honestly." She paused. "She didn't know about the debt, Alexander." He looked at the coffee in his hands. She arranged that introduction with her uncle believing she was building something, Elizabeth said. She believed the story you told her, the same way. She stopped herself. Let the end of that sentence remain unsaid because she had promised herself she would not spend this conversation excavating old hurt. There was too much to do. The same way people generally believe the stories they're told when they want them to be true. I didn't lie to her about everything, he said. The estate is significant. The land is. The land is significant, Elizabeth agreed. Some of it. The 300 acres I own outright are excellent. Your father's original parcel is in recoverable condition if managed correctly for another 2 to 3 seasons. The eastern fields will need investment to sustain yield. None of that is a lie. But $34,000 of debt due in October, with no clear plan of repayment, other than an investment arranged under false pretenses. That is a situation, Alexander, that a person ought to be told about before they bring their uncle's capital into proximity with it. His jaw worked. I would have told her. When? He didn't answer. When the papers were signed and I was gone, Elizabeth said quietly, and the capital was in, and the debt was settled, and there was no longer any reason for her to make a different decision, that is when you would have told her. If you told her at all. The silence that followed was not comfortable. It was the silence of a true thing sitting in a room taking up the space that a convenient fiction had previously occupied. I didn't plan it that way, Alexander said at last. Not deliberately. I didn't sit down and calculate. I know, Elizabeth said. I believe you. I don't think you calculated it. I think you told each piece of the story as it became necessary, and you told each piece in the way that made the next step possible, and you never stepped back to look at all the pieces together, because if you had the picture, would have been uncomfortable. She folded her hands in her lap. That is not the same as innocence, Alexander. But I'll grant you it's not the same as cold premeditation. He looked at her. Really looked at her, the way she had looked at him in the library the night before, and she saw something in his face that she hadn't seen there in a very long time. Not shame exactly, though shame was part of it. Something beneath shame. Something that looked like the first unwilling stages of genuine recognition. You've been keeping this estate alive, he said. Not a question, not a negotiation. Just a man arriving very late at a fact. Yes, she said. For years, yes. And I didn't know. No. And you didn't tell me. I tried, she said. Twice in the first year, once in the second. After that I stopped trying, and I simply did what needed doing. Because the work was more important than the argument, and the argument never ended anywhere useful. He set his coffee cup down on the side table, with the careful, deliberate placement of a man trying to do at least one thing correctly. What do you want? He said. From the meeting this morning. What do you actually want? Elizabeth looked at him. I want what's mine, she said. My land, my accounts, my right to manage what I have built without interference or legal challenge. I want documentation that reflects the actual contribution I have made to this estate, not for pride, but because I intend to use that documentation if this proceeding becomes contested. She paused. And I want my child's future to be secured before anything else is discussed. Alexander went very still, not the practiced stillness of the library yesterday. The true stillness of a man who has just heard something that has reorganized the room around him. Your child, he said. Elizabeth held his gaze. Our child, she said. 7 weeks by my calculation. I hadn't planned to tell you this morning. I'd planned to save it for the formal meeting where there would be witnesses and documents, and no room for the conversation to go anywhere private. But you're here, and you asked what I want, and this is what I want most. Her voice didn't waver, though something in her chest was pressing hard against the steadiness she was determined to maintain. I want this child's future secured. Whatever happens between you and me, whatever decisions are made about this marriage, this child's right to the Harrington name, the Harrington land, the Harrington legacy is not negotiable. It is not a bargaining piece. It is the first thing that gets settled, or nothing else gets settled. Alexander stood up. He didn't go to her. She didn't want him to, and somehow he understood that. He stood where he was in the middle of her sitting room, and he looked at her with that new expression, the one without the architecture of authority. The one that was just a man standing in the full and uncomfortable light of his own consequences, and for a long moment neither of them said anything. 7 weeks, he said. Yes. You knew yesterday. I've known for 3 weeks, she said. I was trying to determine the right moment. Yesterday made the right moment considerably easier to identify. Something crossed his face then that was harder to categorize than the rest of it. Not tenderness. It was too complicated for tenderness, and too late in the conversation for anything uncomplicated. But something adjacent to tenderness. Something that had survived the last 24 hours, battered and stripped down, but intact, which was more than Elizabeth had expected. Elizabeth, he said. Don't, she said, quietly. Not unkindly. Not right now. There is a meeting at 9 o'clock and I need the next hour to finish preparing for it. Whatever else needs to be said between us can wait until after we have handled the things that have lawyers attached to them. He picked up his hat from the table where he'd set it when he came in. He held it in both hands. He looked like a man who had come into a room expecting one conversation and had received in its place the conversation he had needed to have for 3 years and had spent 3 years avoiding. At 9, he said. At 9, Elizabeth said. He left. She closed the door behind him, and she stood there with her back against it, and her eyes closed, and her hand pressed flat against her sternum, where something that was not quite grief and not quite relief was doing something complicated, the way feelings do when they've been organized and managed and held at controlled temperature for long enough that the moment you stop organizing them, they move. She stood there for 30 seconds, maybe 40. Then she pushed off the door and went back to the desk and picked up her pen. She had 40 minutes before she needed to dress for the meeting. And Elizabeth Whitmore had never yet in her life walked into a room unprepared. At 8:55, she came downstairs. She wore the gray dress her father had always said she looked like she could run a bank in the gray dress, which had been the highest compliment in his vocabulary, and she carried the leather document case she'd packed the night before. Her hair was up. Her hands were still. Thomas opened the parlor door for her without being asked. Inside Caldwell. The solicitor was already seated, a narrow man in a brown coat, who looked at her arrival with the particular expression of a man who had been told this meeting would be simple and was beginning to reconsider that assessment. Beside him sat a younger man. She didn't recognize a clerk. She assumed, though he had the watchful eyes of someone who was more than a clerk. Alexander was standing at the window. He turned when she came in. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her upstairs, that stripped-down, rearranged look, and he said nothing, just gave a small nod, and she gave a small nod back. She sat down across from Caldwell, set her document case on the table and opened it. "Good morning," she said. "Shall we begin?" Caldwell cleared his throat. "Mrs. Harrington, I want to assure you that the terms proposed in yesterday's document are quite standard for a dissolution of—" "They're not," Elizabeth said pleasantly. "But thank you. I've prepared a counter-proposal, and I'd like to begin with the land survey because I find it's most efficient to establish the asset picture first before we discuss how it is to be divided." She drew a sheaf of papers from the case and set them on the table between them. "I have documentation here from 3 independent assessors. I also have 6 years of account records, including notation of every improvement made to the Harrington estate at my personal direction with dates and estimated values. I thought we'd start there." Caldwell looked at the papers. Then he looked at Alexander. Alexander said nothing. He just sat down in his chair, folded his hands on the table, and watched his wife begin. Caldwell had been a solicitor for 22 years, and in those 22 years he had sat across the table from grieving widows, furious landowners, bankrupt merchants, and at least one sitting congressman who had wept openly during a property dispute. He believed himself to be a man who could not be surprised by what happened in a negotiation room. He had not before this morning negotiated with Elizabeth Whitmore. By 10 o'clock he had stopped pretending to lead the conversation. By 10:30, his clerk, the watchful young man named Briggs, who was in fact considerably more than a clerk, being a junior solicitor from the Richmond firm that Caldwell had brought in specifically to manage the asset documentation, had quietly pulled out his own pen and begun taking notes on Elizabeth's notes, which was a reversal of the morning's intended dynamic that nobody acknowledged out loud, but everyone in the room felt. "The 300 acres, Elizabeth said, setting the land survey in front of Caldwell with the precision of a woman who had rehearsed this moment in her mind many times, and found the reality of it neither more nor less than she'd prepared for. "Deeded in my name by my father Joshua Whitmore, in the year of my marriage, 1811, with the specific legal provision which you will find on page 4 of that document. Mr. Caldwell, that upon dissolution of this marriage for any cause, those acres revert entirely and without encumbrance to me. That provision was written by my father's attorney, it was reviewed and signed by your firm at the time of the marriage contract, and it has not been altered. Caldwell turned to page 4. He read it. He read it a second time. Then he set the paper down on the table in front of him, with the careful neutrality of a man who has found something he was hoping not to find. The language is clear, Briggs said quietly from his corner. Caldwell looked at Alexander. Alexander was looking at the table. The eastern fields, Elizabeth continued without waiting, have been sustained in part through irrigation improvements, funded from my personal household budget, not from the estate operating accounts from my own quarterly allowance, which I had significantly reduced my personal expenditures to free up over a period of 3 years, a total of approximately $4,000 in improvements. She produced a second set of documents. I have receipts signed by the contractors. I have the account records showing the withdrawals. I have a letter from the land assessor confirming the improvements and estimating their contribution to yield recovery. Caldwell took the documents. He didn't read them the way he'd read the land provision. He looked at them the way a man looks at something that is telling him a story he had not known he needed to hear. Mrs. Harrington, he said carefully, I was not aware of these improvements. No, Elizabeth said. You were retained by my husband. He was not aware of them either, not in any detailed sense. She glanced at Alexander briefly. He was aware that the yields improved. He attributed it to better weather. Alexander's jaw moved. He said nothing. I'm not raising these matters to humiliate anyone, Elizabeth said, and she meant it. Her voice was clear and even, and without the particular edge that comes from a person who is enjoying themselves. She was not enjoying herself. She was doing something necessary, which was a different thing entirely. I'm raising them because any settlement that does not account for these contributions is not an equitable settlement, and I will not sign an inequitable settlement. What precisely are you seeking? Caldwell asked. My land, Elizabeth said. Free and clear, no encumbrances attached by this proceeding. Reimbursement for the documented improvements or equivalent value in a negotiated form. Legal recognition of my management contributions, documented and signed, which I need for reasons that I will explain in a moment, and provision for my child. Caldwell's pen stopped moving. He looked at her. Then he looked at Alexander. Then he looked back at her. I beg your pardon, he said. Did you say your child? I did. Briggs had stopped writing. The room was very quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of a negotiation that has just changed shape entirely, where everyone at the table is rapidly recalculating everything they thought they knew about their position. 7 weeks, Alexander said from his side of the table. His voice was flat and careful, and gave away nothing except that he had known this before the meeting, which Caldwell clearly had not, and that fact alone was rearranging Caldwell's understanding of this morning considerably. Mrs. Harrington informed me this morning. Caldwell set his pen down. He looked at the document in front of him, the dissolution agreement he had spent 3 days preparing, the clean, simple settlement that had been designed to move quickly and leave minimal complications, and he looked at it the way a builder looks at a wall he's just been told is the wrong wall. The terms of this agreement, he said slowly, as drafted do not account for. No, Elizabeth said. They don't, which is why I did not sign them yesterday. Caldwell looked at Alexander with an expression that contained beneath its professional surface a clear and unmistakable subtext, which was, you did not tell me about this, and we are going to have a separate conversation about that later. Alexander met his solicitor's look briefly and then turned back to the table. I would like, Elizabeth said, to discuss the child's provision first, before anything else proceeds. The rest of the settlement, my land, the reimbursements, all of it, I'm willing to negotiate in good faith. But the child's future is not subject to negotiation. It is subject to documentation, and I want that documentation drawn up and agreed upon before we move to anything else. That is an unusual sequencing, Caldwell said. Yes, Elizabeth said. It is. I have my reasons. Caldwell looked at Briggs. Briggs gave the small neutral shrug of a man who has been watching this proceed and has arrived at the same conclusion. Elizabeth had started from, which was that unusual sequencing was the least unusual thing about this morning. Very well, Caldwell said. Let's discuss the child. It took 90 minutes. Elizabeth had expected it to take longer because in her experience, things that involved men acknowledging what they owed took longer than they should. But Caldwell was whatever his other qualities, a competent solicitor, and a competent solicitor understood when he was looking at a situation where his client's position was considerably weaker than his client had previously represented, and he adjusted. By noon, there was a preliminary agreement on paper, handwritten by Briggs. Unsigned, but witnessed establishing the framework of the child's inheritance rights. The Harrington name. The right to the estate in the event of Alexander's death without other heirs. A financial provision independent of the marriage settlement, held in trust, administered by a trustee to be agreed upon. Elizabeth read it 3 times before she nodded. "I'll want my own attorney to review the language," she said. "There's a firm in Richmond, Howell and Marsh. Mr. Howell handled my father's estate, and he knows my situation." "Of course," Caldwell said. "I'll send word to him today." She set the paper down. "We can reconvene when both parties have reviewed the full document." She was gathering her papers when Alexander spoke. "Elizabeth." She looked up. Howe was watching her with that look he'd been wearing since the previous morning. The one without the scaffolding of the Duke. The one that was just a man looking at the facts of his own life. "I would like to know," he said carefully, "what the legal recognition of your management contributions is for." She met his eyes. "Because I intend to establish my own enterprise," she said. "My land, my resources, my record of successful management. I need documentation that supports my capability, established in a legal context that cannot later be disputed or attributed to my husband's oversight." She paused. "I'm going to need credit, Alexander. From merchants, from investors, from banks. A woman seeking credit needs proof of capability. I have that proof. I need it in a form that is legally recognized." Caldwell looked at her. Then to his credit, he nodded once. "That is foresighted." "I've had time to think about it," Elizabeth said. She closed her document case. She stood. And that was when the parlor door opened without a knock. The woman who came in was 63 years old, dressed in the darkest blue Elizabeth had seen outside of a funeral, and she had the posture of someone who had been making entrances into rooms since before most people in those rooms were born. Her name was Catherine Harrington, the Dowager Alexander's mother, and she had arrived from her house in Fredericksburg, apparently sometime in the last hour, which meant someone at Harrington Manor had sent word to her yesterday, and Elizabeth filed that information away without letting any awareness of it show on her face. Catherine Harrington looked at the table, at the papers, at Caldwell, at Briggs, at her son. Then she looked at Elizabeth. "I came as soon as I heard," she said. Her voice was the kind of voice that had spent 6 decades being listened to and had never developed any uncertainty about whether it would continue to be. "Good morning, Mrs. Harrington," Elizabeth said. Catherine's eyes moved over her, not cruelly, but completely, the way a woman who has survived 63 years in a world run by men looks at another woman who is currently in the middle of surviving it too. "Sit down, Alexander," Catherine said without looking at him. He had, Elizabeth noticed, stood when his mother entered, which was the first reflexive, unconsidered thing she'd seen him do in 2 days. He sat. Catherine did not sit. She moved to the side of the table, not Caldwell's side, not Elizabeth's side, but the end. The head of the table, which was nominally no one's position, and which she occupied with the ease of someone who considers all positions nominally hers. "I understand," Catherine said, "that there were divorce papers on a silver tray in my family's library yesterday afternoon." "Yes," Alexander said, "and that they remain unsigned." "Yes," Elizabeth said. Catherine looked at her son. "I also understand," she said, "that Edmund's investment capital is somewhere in this situation, and that Mercer Holdings is somewhere in this situation, and that a Monroe girl was in my house yesterday, and that I was told none of this." The silence in the room had a different quality now. Not the silence of a negotiation. The silence of a house that had been keeping secrets from its matriarch, and was now standing in the full light of her awareness, blinking. "Edmund's money," Alexander said. "That was—" "Do not," Catherine said, and her voice didn't rise, which made it more effective. "Tell me it was handled, Nothing in this room was handled. Nothing about this situation is handled. She turned to Elizabeth. How much does the Mercer debt total? $34,000, Elizabeth said. Due in October. Catherine's expression didn't change. But something shifted in it. The particular shift of a woman who has suspected a number, and has now been given a number, and is discovering that the two are approximately the same. Edmund gave you $20,000, she said to Alexander. Yes. He told me it was for the mill expansion. Alexander said nothing. He told me, Catherine repeated with the slow precision of a woman laying each word down like evidence that the capital was for the Pendleton Mill Partnership, that the estate was expanding its production relationships. She paused. That is why I did not object. That is why I told him to help his brother. I intended to repay it through the Monroe girl's uncle, Catherine said. The room went still again. I know about Gerald Monroe, Catherine said. He and I have a mutual acquaintance in Fredericksburg. She wrote to me this morning because she thought I should know that Gerald had been approached about a significant investment in the Harrington estate and was reconsidering that investment in light of some new information he'd received. Catherine looked at Elizabeth. From his niece, Charlotte, Elizabeth thought. Charlotte had gone to her uncle this morning. She had done exactly what Elizabeth had suggested. Gerald Monroe, Catherine continued, is not going to invest in this estate. Not at the moment, and not until he understands the actual financial position. She looked at Caldwell. What is the actual financial position, Mr. Caldwell? Caldwell cleared his throat. The estate's operational accounts are... I can answer that, Elizabeth said. Everyone looked at her. She reached into her document case and produced the ledger summary she'd prepared, the one she'd written by hand the night before, the full picture, assets and liabilities, the honest version. She set it on the table and turned it so Catherine could read it from where she stood. Catherine read it. She read it with the focused, unhurried attention of a woman who has been managing her own finances quietly for decades and knows exactly what she's looking at. When she finished, she set the paper down. She looked at Alexander with an expression Elizabeth had never seen on another human face. The specific expression of a parent who loves their child without condition and is simultaneously furious with them without reservation, and who has decided that love and fury do not need to be resolved before the facts are addressed. Did you know, Catherine said to Alexander, that your wife prepared this? I know now, Alexander said. Did you know any of it before yesterday? Alexander's hands were flat on the table. No. She has been managing this estate, Catherine said. Not a question, looking at the ledger. Yes, Alexander said. For how long? 3 years at minimum, Elizabeth said, in various capacities since the first year of our marriage. Catherine looked at her. It was a long look, and it was not simple. There was something in it that Elizabeth recognized because she had seen it occasionally in older women, the look of someone who has navigated the same landscape 30 years earlier, on worse roads with fewer tools, and who is assessing whether the younger woman in front of her knows how hard the path actually is. Why didn't you come to me? Catherine said. When the accounts began deteriorating, Elizabeth met her gaze. Because I didn't know whether you would believe me over your son, she said honestly. And because I thought I believed for longer than I should have that it was possible to fix it from the inside without it becoming this. Catherine was quiet for a moment. And the child, she said. Elizabeth held very still. Yes, Catherine turned to her son. You are going to sit there and explain to me, she said, exactly how you arrived at a plan to divorce a woman who has been running your estate and is carrying your child in order to marry a girl whose uncle's money you needed to cover a debt your brother doesn't know you have. The silence that followed was absolute. Alexander opened his mouth, closed it. He had the look of a man who has reached the end of all his prepared defenses and is standing in open ground. I didn't, he started. Don't tell me you didn't plan it that way, Catherine said, and for the first time her voice sharpened. That is not the defense you think it is. A man who does not plan badly still does badly. Intentions are not the same as actions. Alexander and I have been telling you that since you were 8 years old. Caldwell had. Elizabeth noticed very quietly, begun attempting to be invisible. Briggs was writing rapidly with the focused attention of a man documenting something that he understands will be referenced later. The matter of the child changes this situation entirely, Catherine said. She pulled out the chair at the head of the table and sat down. Not because a child changes the fundamental question of whether this marriage can continue. That question belongs to Elizabeth and to Alexander, and I am not going to insert myself into it. But it changes the question of what any dissolution looks like, and whether the current terms are remotely adequate. He looked at Caldwell. Are the current terms adequate? The terms as drafted, Caldwell said carefully, were prepared without knowledge of Mrs. Harrington's condition, and without full knowledge of her contributions to the estate. I would say they require significant revision. Then revise them, Catherine said. She looked at Elizabeth, and in her eyes there was something that had not been in anyone else's eyes in this conversation. Not sympathy exactly, which Elizabeth didn't want, but recognition. The recognition of a woman who had sat at enough tables and been spoken past at enough of them to know what it cost to have what Elizabeth had in this room right now. What do you want? Catherine asked her. Not the way Alexander had asked it this morning with the weight of guilt searching for a direction, but directly, as one person to another. Elizabeth looked at the dowager. I want what I've earned, she said. And I want my child raised knowing exactly where they come from both sides of this family, equally with full rights and full standing. I want no ambiguity about that in legal documents in this family or in this community. Catherine nodded once. Then that is what we will establish. She turned to Alexander. You will not contest this, she said. It was not phrased as a command, and it was not phrased as a request. It was phrased as a statement of what was going to occur. Alexander looked at his mother. Then he looked at his wife. Something in his face had been coming undone since yesterday morning. Slowly, the way ice comes up. In late winter, not all at once. Not dramatically, but steadily. Piece by piece, the architecture of a man's assumptions, releasing their grip on the actual shape of things. He looked at Elizabeth, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. No, he said quietly. I won't contest it. Catherine nodded. She looked at Caldwell. I'd like your clerk to draw up revised terms that incorporate the child's provision already discussed. The land reversion as it stands in the original marriage contract, and a fair accounting of the estate contributions Elizabeth has documented. I'd like a draft by end of week. She paused. And I would like separately, and as soon as possible, a complete accounting of Edmund's $20,000 where it went, and how you intend to address it. He is going to need to be told. I'll tell him, Alexander said. Yes, Catherine said. You will. She rose from the table. The meeting had not been called to a close by anyone with the formal authority to call it, but it closed anyway. The way things close when the person with the most gravity in the room stands up. Elizabeth was gathering her papers when Catherine stopped beside her. Walk with me, the older woman said. I'd like some air. They walked through the back hallway toward the east garden door. Elizabeth had been through that door 100 times, knew every creak of the floorboards, every draft that came through the gap in the third window's frame, and Catherine walked beside her with the particular straightness of a woman who carried her own spine, as though it were the most important thing she owned. They came outside into the summer morning, and the heat pressed down immediate and total, and a mockingbird. Somewhere in the elm tree above the garden wall sang 4 different songs in quick succession, as though it had a lot to say and limited time to say it. Catherine walked without preamble. I owe you an apology, she said. Elizabeth looked at her sidelong. I knew, Catherine said, that Alexander's attention had gone elsewhere. Not the specifics, not Charlotte Monroe in particular. But I knew he was not. I knew the marriage had become something other than what it should be. She paused. I did not ask because I did not want to know, which is a luxury I should not have permitted myself, and I am telling you this, not because it changes anything that has happened, but because you deserve to know that you were not as invisible as you may have thought. Elizabeth was quiet for a moment. Why are you telling me now? Because you walked into a room yesterday with divorce papers on a tray, Catherine said, and you did not fall apart. And you walked into a negotiation this morning with 6 years of documentation and a child and a plan, and you handled yourself better than anyone in that room who had a title. She stopped walking. She turned to look at Elizabeth directly. I want to know how. Elizabeth blinked. Of all the questions she had prepared for today, this was not among them. I kept notes, she said. Don't be modest. I'm not being modest, Elizabeth said. I kept notes because I knew someday I might need them. I kept working because the work needed doing. She stopped. I kept going because there was no other option that I was willing to take. And because I absolutely refused to let this place and this situation convince me that I was less than what I knew I was. Catherine looked at her for a long moment. You're going to be all right, she said. Not as comfort, as assessment. Yes, Elizabeth said. I am. The child will be all right too, Elizabeth said. I'm going to make sure of it. Catherine nodded. She looked out at the garden, the lines of it, the careful order, the beds that Elizabeth had redesigned 2 summers ago, with the help of the groundskeeper, because the original layout wasted water in the dry months. I'd like to be involved, Catherine said. In the child's life. Whatever happens between you and Alexander, I want that to be known. It's known, Elizabeth said. Catherine turned back toward the house. Come back inside when you're ready. There's still the question of the Mercer debt, and I have some thoughts about that, which don't involve Gerald Monroe's capital. You have a solution. I have a contact in Philadelphia, Catherine said, walking. A man who owes me a considerable favor from 1804. I have been saving that favor for something important. She paused at the door. I think this qualifies. She went inside. Elizabeth stood in the summer heat and listened to the mockingbird, which had started up again. A different song now, something it had apparently picked up from somewhere else, and was trying to work out whether it liked. She stood there for a while. She had come into this morning carrying everything she needed and holding it tightly, because holding things tightly was how she'd survived the last 3 years. She'd walked into that room ready for a fight, ready for dismissal, ready for all the familiar ways a woman with everything to lose gets reminded she has no standing. What she had not been ready for, what she was even now not entirely sure how to hold, was the moment Catherine Harrington had looked at her across a table and said without qualification, without agenda, with the simple directness of one capable woman recognizing another. What do you want? Not what will you accept. Not what can we give you to make this go away. What do you want? Elizabeth pressed her hand flat against the warm stone wall of the manor house. Her child's house, her ground, her water, her 300 acres, her 6 years of documented labor and quiet determination and refused despair. She took one breath deep and full, the kind you take when you have been in a room a long time and have finally gotten outside. Then she straightened her spine, and she went back inside to help solve the debt that was going to require all of them to work together, whether they had intended to or not. She did not know, walking back through that door, that before the day was out, she would discover that Graves, the foreman she had trusted for 3 years, had not been entirely honest with her either. That the supply skimming she thought she'd caught and stopped in February had continued in a different account, in a different column, buried under a line item for maintenance, that Elizabeth had reviewed but not questioned, because she had trusted him, and trust, even careful trust, even earned trust, was always in the end someone's gamble. She did not know yet that the evidence of it was sitting in the bottom of the estate ledger she'd left on the parlor table, visible to anyone who looked at the right column with the right knowledge. She did not know that Briggs, the watchful young man who was more than a clerk, had already found it. And she did not know that finding it would change in ways she hadn't anticipated everything she thought she understood about who in this house had been protecting her and who had not. But she was about to find out. Briggs was waiting in the hallway when Elizabeth came back inside. Howe was standing with the estate ledger in his hands, the one she'd left on the parlor table, the one she'd opened for Catherine's review, and he was holding it the way a person holds something they've picked up and then discovered they weren't sure what to do with. His face had the careful neutrality of a man who was trying to determine before he said anything exactly whose side of the table he was standing on. Elizabeth stopped. She looked at his face, then at the ledger, then back at his face. "You found something," she said. "Mrs. Harrington." He hesitated. Not long, just the half-second of a man deciding to be direct. "May I show you something in private?" She took him to the small sitting room off the east corridor, the one the household used for informal meetings, and she closed the door and she turned to face him with her hands folded in front of her, and her face composed, because she had already spent 2 days being surprised by things, and she had decided somewhere between the garden and the hallway that she was done letting surprise show before she understood what she was dealing with. "Show me," she said. He opened the ledger to a page near the back. The maintenance accounts. She knew this section. She had reviewed it herself. She had been through these columns in February, when she caught Graves skimming the supply orders and believed she'd stopped it. Briggs pointed to a line item, then another, then a third. Elizabeth looked at the numbers. Then she looked at the dates beside them. Then she took the ledger from his hands and carried it to the window and read through 4 pages without saying a word. When she looked up, Briggs was watching her with that careful, watchful expression. "How much?" she said. "Over the past 8 months, Briggs said. "As best I can determine from what's in this ledger alone, approximately $2,300. Elizabeth set the ledger down on the side table. She pressed both hands flat on the cover of it and stood there for a moment with her eyes closed. $2,300. After she had found the first skimming. After she had confronted Graves indirectly, carefully, through the foreman's own accounting adjustments, never in a direct confrontation, because she'd wanted to give him the opportunity to stop after she had believed he had stopped. He hadn't stopped. He had moved it. "I was careful about it," Briggs said. He wasn't saying it to excuse anything. He was saying it because it was true, and Elizabeth appreciated that. He used the maintenance category because it's the one with the most legitimate variance. Equipment repair, seasonal labor adjustments, material costs. Hard to question individually. It requires looking at the pattern across months. "Which I did," Elizabeth said. "In February." She opened her eyes. "I looked at the pattern across months in February, and I saw the supply skimming, and I believed I'd closed it." "He changed categories," Briggs said. "Same behavior, different column." She looked at him. "Why are you telling me this? Your client is Mr. Harrington." Briggs was quiet for a moment. He was young, mid-20s, she estimated, with the kind of face that hadn't yet decided whether it was going to be handsome or just honest. At the moment, it was being very honest. "Mr. Caldwell's client is Mr. Harrington," Briggs said carefully. "I am employed by the firm. My job this morning was to document the asset settlement." He paused. "The foreman's conduct is an asset matter. It affects the estate's value and its financial position. It is directly relevant to the settlement being negotiated." Another pause. "And it affects your position, Mrs. Harrington, in a way that I don't think should be hidden from you when I'm the one who found it." Elizabeth looked at him for a long, assessing moment. "How did you come to work for Caldwell's firm?" she asked. Not because it was the most important question, but because she was recalibrating, and she had learned that understanding a person's history was the fastest route to understanding their behavior. "My mother's family is from Charlottesville," he said. "My grandfather was a land assessor." He paused. "He worked with a Mr. Colby on several surveys in this county. Colby spoke highly of the landowner on the Whitmore parcel when I first came to the firm." A careful pause. "He said she asked better questions than most of the men he'd worked for." Elizabeth was quiet for a moment. Then something happened to her face that wasn't quite a smile. It was smaller than a smile, and it sat deeper. The look of a woman who has discovered that she was seen at a moment when she didn't know anyone was looking. "All right, she said. "What do you recommend we do with this?" "That's your decision, ma'am," Briggs said. "But if I were advising you, and I'm aware that I technically am not, I would say that this information changes your leverage in the settlement considerably. Graves has been stealing from the estate. The estate is party to the settlement. The settlement figure should reflect what the estate would be worth without that loss, and it should also reflect the additional management burden you carried without knowing the true extent of what was being taken." Elizabeth picked up the ledger. "I'd like you to prepare a separate documentation of these figures," she said. "Dated today, your signature as witness. Can you do that without creating a conflict with your firm's representation of my husband?" Briggs thought about it. Really thought, not the quick deflection of a man avoiding something, but the actual consideration of a man working through a genuine question. "It's a factual accounting of estate records," he said finally. "I'm documenting what's in the ledger. That's not advocacy for either party. That's evidence." "Good," Elizabeth said. "Then please do that. I'll need it before the end of the day." She handed him the ledger. He took it, nodded, and left. Elizabeth stood in the quiet room and breathed through the anger slowly, the way she'd learned to breathe through things that warranted anger, not suppressing it, not performing calm, but actually processing it, the way you process a real thing, letting it move through her completely, until what was left on the other side was not anger, but information. Graves, who had been at Harrington Manor for 11 years, who had worked under Alexander's father, and then Alexander, who Elizabeth had trusted enough to implement her crop rotation suggestion without telling Alexander, who had looked her in the face in February and adjusted his accounts and let her believe the problem was solved. She thought about what that meant. Not just for the money. Though the money mattered, $2,300 was not a small thing, but for what it said about the position she'd been in. Trying to fix things quietly. Working without authority. Managing through influence and patience, and the slow accumulation of trust in a household where her actual standing had never been formally recognized. Graves had stolen from her because he understood correctly that she would handle it quietly, that she would not want the confrontation, that she would try to give him the chance to stop. He had understood her better than she'd understood him. That was useful information. It was also infuriating information. She straightened her spine, and she went to find Alexander. How was in the library? Not behind the desk this time. He was standing at the bookshelves along the far wall, not reading anything, just standing the way a man stands in a familiar room when he is trying to locate himself in it, and finding that harder than it used to be. He heard her come in. He turned. She set the facts in front of him without preamble because she was tired and he needed to know. Graves has been stealing from the estate accounts, not just the supply skimming I caught in February. He moved it to the maintenance column and continued for 8 more months. Approximately $2,300. Briggs found it in the ledger. Alexander's face went through something complex and quick. Graves. Yes. I've known that man since I was 12 years old, Alexander said. I know, Elizabeth said. Which is probably why he thought he could. Alexander moved away from the bookshelf. His jaw was tight and she could see him working through it, the personal betrayal of it, the long history of it, the particular sting of discovering that loyalty is not always what it presents itself as. She knew that feeling. She was having a version of it herself at this very moment. I need to speak with him, Alexander said. Yes, Elizabeth said. You do. But I'd like to be there. He looked at her. Why? Because he stole from this estate while I was managing it, she said. Because he looked at me in February and let me believe I'd solved it and kept going. Because whatever conversation you have with him, I have a right to be part of it. She paused. And because if this is going to become part of the settlement documentation, which it is, I need to have heard his explanation directly, not secondhand. Alexander held her gaze. Then he nodded. All right. They sent Thomas for Graves. Tete. The foreman came in from the fields, still wearing his work coat hat in hand, with the unhurried ease of a man who has been summoned before and has learned that the manner of your entrance shapes the manner of the conversation. He was a broad man, somewhere near 50, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent 30 years outdoors and the careful eyes of someone who had spent 30 years watching. He looked at Alexander. Then he looked at Elizabeth. And in the single moment before his expression settled into its practiced steadiness, she saw it, the thing she'd missed in February because she hadn't been looking for it. Not guilt exactly. Something older and more practiced than guilt. The look of a man who has known for some time that a particular accounting would eventually arrive and has been deciding ever since how he would meet it. Mr. Graves, Alexander said. Sir, Graves said. His voice was even. Everything about him was even in the way of a man who has decided on his posture before entering the room. I need you to explain something to me, Alexander said. He was using the voice Elizabeth recognized from formal estate business flat, careful, giving nothing. The maintenance accounts for the past 8 months, the variance in the repair line. I'd like your accounting of those figures. Graves looked at the account ledger that was sitting on the desk. Briggs had left it there. A certain kind of man would have seen the ledger and recalibrated immediately. Graves looked at it, and something moved behind his eyes, and then his expression settled back into steadiness. Seasonal repairs came in high this year, he said. The east fence line needed full replacement. The mill wheel housing needed reinforcement before the summer. Mr. Graves, Elizabeth said. He looked at her. Not the way he usually looked at her, with the respectful, slightly condescending attention of a man acknowledging the mistress of a household. He looked at her with something that was closer to recognition. The recognition of someone who has been caught not by a trap, but by a pair of eyes that turned out to be considerably sharper than he'd accounted for. I caught the supply skimming in February, Elizabeth said. I adjusted the accounts, and I believed you'd understood the matter was closed. The maintenance column didn't occur to me because I trusted your judgment on repair costs. She paused. I want to know how long you believed I wouldn't look again. Graves was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I reckoned you had enough to manage. The simplicity of it was almost stunning. Elizabeth looked at him steadily. You reckoned I was busy enough that I wouldn't notice. I reckoned, Graves said, and now something in him had dropped the steadiness, not dramatically, just enough that the man beneath it became briefly visible. That you was handling so much that wasn't yours to handle, that a careful man could find some room in the edges. It was yours to handle, Alexander said, his voice harder now. All of it. Every account in this estate was yours to handle responsibly. With respect, sir, Graves said, and his eyes moved to Alexander briefly before coming back to Elizabeth. I've been working this land for 11 years, under your father and under you. And for the last 3 years, the person who actually came to me with real solutions, who actually understood the soil and the rotation and the contracts, wasn't in this room until this summer. He stopped. I ain't saying that justifies what I did. I'm saying that when a man's working for 2 different authorities and only one of them knows what they're doing, he starts making calculations about where his real loyalty lies. The room was very still. Elizabeth stared at him. You stole from this estate, she said slowly, because you believed I wasn't getting what I was owed, and that was your way of what exactly? Correcting the balance. Seemed like someone ought to, Graves said. The audacity of it was so complete that for a moment Elizabeth couldn't locate an adequate response. She just looked at him. This man who had worked beside her for 3 years, who she had trusted, who had apparently constructed from his own moral reasoning a justification for theft that involved being, in his estimation, a kind of irregular justice on her behalf. That was not your decision to make, she said. Her voice was quiet and completely without heat, which was more final than anger would have been. Not on my behalf, not on anyone's behalf. You didn't take that money for me. You took it for yourself, and you reached for a reason afterward. Graves's jaw tightened. He didn't argue. Here is what's going to happen, Elizabeth said. The full accounting of what was taken is going to be documented. That documentation will be reviewed by Mr. Caldwell and by Mr. Howell of the Richmond firm. The figure will be addressed in the estate settlement as an undisclosed liability. She paused. And you are going to give Alexander a complete accounting today in writing of every figure in every column you touched in the past 3 years. Every one. And then, Graves said. And then, Alexander said, and his voice had found the authority that had been missing from it for 2 days. Not the performed authority of the Duke, but the real authority of a man who has arrived late and badly at understanding what he is responsible for, that accounting will determine what happens next. Graves looked at them both. He looked at them the way a man looks when he has reached the end of a very long road he chose himself and has found it ends exactly where all such roads end. Yes, sir, he said. He left. Alexander sat down heavily in the desk chair. The same chair Elizabeth had sat in 2 days ago when she'd walked into this room and found the divorce papers, and made the choice that had led by a route neither of them had anticipated to this moment. I wasn't wrong, Alexander said, about the 2 authorities. Elizabeth looked at him. No, he wasn't. That was my fault, Alexander said. It came out without the careful phrasing he usually applied to things that cost him something. It came out plain. Not his theft. That was his own doing. But the situation he described, that was mine. Elizabeth didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything to say. It was true, and he knew it, and adding to it would only be cruelty at this point. What happens now, Alexander said, with the settlement? He stopped. With all of it. Howell arrives from Richmond tomorrow, Elizabeth said. I sent word this morning. Once he's reviewed everything, the child's provision, my land, the Graves accounting, all of it, we'll have a complete picture of what a fair settlement looks like. She paused. And then we'll sign what needs signing. And after that, she looked at him carefully. I'm going to take up residence in the Whitmore house, she said. My father's property. It's mine, and it's been sitting empty since he passed, and it's close enough to the estate that... She stopped. That the child will be able to know both properties, both families. Alexander was quiet. I'm not going to fight you, he said. I know. I want to be clear about that. Whatever Caldwell may have... Alexander, she said. I know. He nodded. He looked at his hands. I told Edmund this morning, he said, about the money. He stopped. He was not pleased. No, Elizabeth said. I imagine he wasn't. I wants to speak with you, Alexander said. He said. He stopped again, and this time the stopping had a different quality, like a man arriving at something he'd been working toward and finding it harder to say than he'd expected. He said you were the only one in this family who had been consistently honest about the estate situation, and he wanted to apologize for not knowing sooner. Elizabeth said nothing. Something was happening in her chest. Not grief, not triumph, but something that sat between them and felt a great deal like the particular exhaustion of having been right for a very long time in a place where being right hadn't been enough. Tell Edmund there's nothing to apologize for, she said. He didn't know because he wasn't told. That's not the same as not caring. Alexander looked at her with that expression she'd come to recognize over the past 2 days, the one without the scaffolding, the one that was just a man. Was there ever a point, he said quietly, when you might have told me? When things might have, when I might have listened? Elizabeth considered this honestly. She owed him honesty, she thought. Not kindness, not comfort, but the actual truth, which was more valuable than both. There were moments, she said, early on. The first winter when I found the soil assessment, and I wanted to talk to you about the rotation. I came to you 3 times in 1 week. You were kind about it, but you were certain I was overreacting. You called me thorough, which is what people call women when they want to compliment their worry without taking it seriously. She paused. After that, I started handling things directly because it was faster and it worked. And somewhere in the handling of it, I stopped trying to make you understand and just... She stopped. I just did the work. I called you thorough, he said. You did. He closed his eyes briefly, opened them. I called you thorough, he said again, but this time it wasn't a question. It was a man repeating a thing back to himself so that he would not forget it. Yes, Elizabeth said. They sat in that for a moment. I'm going to change how the estate is run, Alexander said. Going forward. Whatever our arrangement becomes, whatever we are to each other after the settlement, the management structure needs to be different. I need to understand what's happening in my own land. That would be wise, Elizabeth said. I'd like... He stopped. I'm not asking for anything. I'm not in a position to ask for anything at the moment. But I want you to know that I intend to be involved. In the management. In the child's life. In all of it as much as you'll allow. Elizabeth stood. She picked up her document case. She looked at him across the desk. This man she had married at 25, believing despite everything that love and patience and intelligence could build something good. And she felt the full weight of what they had lost clearly and completely, without flinching. Ask Edmund to call on me tomorrow, she said. Before Howell arrives. I want to speak with him about the investment situation and about the Mercer debt. Catherine mentioned a contact in Philadelphia, but there may be other options, and Edmund knows the financial networks better than anyone. I'll tell him, Alexander said. She moved toward the door. Elizabeth, Alexander said. She stopped, didn't turn. I'm sorry, he said. Not for the settlement, or the documents, or any of the things that have lawyers attached to them. For the years of it. For calling you thorough. She stood in the doorway for a moment. I know you are, she said. And she meant it not as forgiveness, not yet, maybe not ever in the full sense, but as acknowledgement. She knew he meant it. She knew it was real. And that mattered not because it changed what had happened, but because it was the first true thing he'd said to her in longer than she could easily calculate. She walked out. Charlotte Munro left Harrington Manor that afternoon. Elizabeth knew because Margaret told her quietly, while helping her change into a cooler dress before supper. Charlotte had spoken to her uncle that morning, and Gerald Munro had sent a carriage by 3 o'clock, and Charlotte had come downstairs with a single trunk and had waited in the front hall for it with the composure of a young woman who had decided in the space of 36 hours that composure was the only thing left that belonged entirely to her. Elizabeth was on the landing when Charlotte crossed the front hall below. Charlotte looked up. They looked at each other for a long moment. Two women standing at very different heights in the same house connected by a man. Neither of them had entirely known, arriving at the end of something that had cost them both more than it should have. "Charlotte," Elizabeth said. Charlotte stopped. Her chin was up. Her eyes were dry. "For what it's worth," Elizabeth said, "you did the right thing, going to your uncle." Charlotte looked at her. "He's furious," she said. "My uncle. He has reason to be." "Not at me," Charlotte said. "At Alexander. He said—" She stopped. "He said he'd been sold a fairy story, and he intended to have a complete accounting before he made any further decisions." "Good," Elizabeth said. Charlotte was quiet for a moment. She looked like she had something else to say, and was weighing whether to say it. Then she said, "I hope the child is healthy." It was simple. It was the simplest thing anyone had said to Elizabeth in 2 days. Not a negotiation, not a documentation, not an apology laced with self-interest. Just one woman saying to another, "I hope the small life is well." Elizabeth felt something move in her chest. "Thank you," she said. Charlotte nodded once. She picked up her bag, and she walked out the front door of Harrington Manor without looking back, which was, Elizabeth thought, probably the smartest thing she had done since she arrived. That night, for the first time in 3 days, Elizabeth slept. Not all night. She woke at 2 in the morning with her hand on her stomach and her mind already moving through the Howell meeting, the Edmund conversation, the Graves accounting. The Philadelphia contact Catherine had mentioned, but she slept, and when she woke, the thinking that started up was not the panicked scrambling of a woman trying to hold things together, but the steady, purposeful planning of one who already knows she can. She lay in the dark, and she thought about the Whitmore house. Her father had built it 40 years ago. A solid house on good land, plain and well made in the way of a man who believed in function and didn't trust ornament. She'd grown up in it. She'd left it for Harrington Manor at 25, and she'd told herself it was a beginning and not an ending. It turned out it was both. She thought about what it would look like, the house reopened, aired out the fields under proper management, the workers treated fairly, a household that was hers, from the floor to the ceiling, without negotiation or permission, or the constant low-grade work of making herself legible to someone who had decided not to read her. She thought about her child growing up in it, running across the fields her grandfather had worked, learning the land the way Elizabeth had learned it, not as something to be inherited, but as something to be understood, cared for, answered to. She thought about what she'd said to Catherine in the garden, "I want what I've earned." Lying in the dark, she revised it. She wanted more than that. She wanted what she could build, what she hadn't built yet, the parts of herself that had been going entirely into holding things together for 6 years, and that were now for the first time available for something else. Something that was hers entirely. Something that would not require her to make herself smaller so that someone else could feel larger. She pressed her hand against her stomach again. "We're going to be all right," she said aloud to the dark, to no one, to the small life she was already beginning to plan around. "I promise you that." The dark said nothing back, which was fine. She'd learned over 6 years to trust her own word more than most of what the dark might have offered. She closed her eyes. Tomorrow Howell, tomorrow Edmund. Tomorrow the rest of the accounting, the rest of the documentation, the rest of the slow and careful work of disentangling a life from the shape it had been pressed into. And after tomorrow, the first day of something that was not maintenance, not rescue, not the quiet labor of keeping someone else's house from falling down. The first day of building her own. Howell arrived from Richmond the next morning on the 8 o'clock road, driving himself in a plain black carriage with no markings, which was exactly the kind of man he was. No performance, no announcement, just presence and competence, and 40 years of knowing exactly what a document meant and what it didn't. Howe was 61 years old, short with white hair, and the kind of eyes that had been reading people across desks for so long, they did it automatically, the way other men breathed. He had handled Joshua Whitmore's estate with the same unhurried precision. He handled everything, and when Elizabeth had sent word to him 2 days ago, he had not replied with questions. He had simply arrived. She met him in the front parlor. He looked at her for a moment, the kind of look that took inventory without being rude about it, and then he said, "You look like your father when he was about to win an argument." "I have documentation," she said. "I assumed you did," he said. "Show me." She showed him everything. The land survey, the 6 years of account records, the graves accounting that Briggs had documented the previous afternoon, signed and dated, the child's preliminary provision framework that Caldwell and Briggs had drafted, Catherine's letter to the Philadelphia contact which had arrived that morning with a preliminary response that was more promising than Elizabeth had let herself hope. Howell read all of it without interrupting. He read the way her father had read fully before speaking because he believed that speaking before reading was how men made expensive mistakes. When he finished, he set the last paper down and looked at her. "The child's provision is workable, but the language in Clause 3 is vague in a way that will cause problems in 10 years, he said. "I'll fix it. The land reversion is airtight. Your father's attorney was thorough, credit to him. The Graves matter needs to be handled as a separate legal proceeding, not folded into the settlement, or it will complicate both." He paused. "The Philadelphia contact, do you know this man?" "Catherine Harrington does," Elizabeth said. "He owes her a favor from 1804. Howell raised his eyebrows slightly. "Catherine Harrington is involved in this. She arrived yesterday morning. That changes the picture considerably," he said. He looked at the Philadelphia letter again. "This man Alderman Presswick, he's a sound investor. Conservative, which means if Catherine has briefed him on the estate's actual position, his interest is genuine and not speculative." He set the letter down. "This could resolve the Mercer debt without the Monroe capital and without Edmund's investment being called in early." "That's what I'm hoping," Elizabeth said. "Then let's make sure the settlement is done before Presswick makes any formal commitment." Howell said, "Because the last thing you want is your financial future tied to the estate's debt resolution in a way that blurs the line between what's yours and what's Alexander Harrington's." "Agreed," Elizabeth said. Howell picked up his pen. "I'll need 2 hours with these documents before we meet with Caldwell." He looked at her. "Is Edmund Harrington available this morning? I understand he's involved." "He's in the east sitting room," Elizabeth said. "He arrived an hour before you did." Howell nodded. "I'll speak with him first." He paused. "And the Duke himself?" "Available when needed," Elizabeth said. "He's not contesting." Howell looked at her steadily. "You sound very certain of that." "I am," she said. He studied her for a moment, that inventory look again. "Your father would be proud of you," he said. "Not as comfort, as fact." Elizabeth held that for a second, the way you hold something that is true and also costs something to receive. "I know," she said. "Now go talk to Edmund before he rearranges all my furniture out of anxiety." Howell actually smiled at that brief dry and went. Edmund Harrington was 32 years old and looked, Elizabeth had always thought, like what Alexander might have been if someone had knocked some of the certainty out of him early. He had the same jaw, the same height, but where Alexander carried himself like a man who had been told since birth that the world would arrange itself around him. Edmund moved through rooms like a man who understood the world didn't particularly care about his convenience and had made his peace with that. How was standing when she came in? He'd been standing since he arrived. She suspected Edmund wasn't a sitting still kind of man when something was bothering him. "Elizabeth," he said, and then immediately, "I'm sorry." "Edmund." "No," he said, and his voice had the particular firmness of a man who had been rehearsing something and was going to say it regardless of interruption. "I'm sorry. I gave Alexander that money because he asked, and because he was my brother, and because I wanted to believe that whatever was happening in his marriage and in this estate, he had it in hand." He stopped. "He didn't have it in hand." "No," Elizabeth said. "He didn't." "You had it in hand," Edmund said. She met his eyes. "Most of it. He told me yesterday what you'd been doing. The rotation, the accounts, the mill contract." Edmund's jaw was tight. "He told me about the child." He paused. "I didn't know about the child." "It's recent," Elizabeth said. "He should have led with that," Edmund said, and the sharpness in his voice was not directed at her. "When he came to me yesterday, he should have led with that instead of..." He stopped. He talked about the settlement for 20 minutes before he mentioned it. 20 minutes. Elizabeth said nothing. Edmund moved to the window, then back. He was processing something. She could see it moving through him, the combination of anger at his brother and something more complicated, underneath something that had been building longer than yesterday. "I've known for a while," he said, "that things here weren't what Alexander claimed. I didn't push because I didn't want the fight. I told myself it wasn't my business." He looked at her. "It became my business when I gave him $20,000. "Yes," Elizabeth said. "What do you need from me?" Edmund said. It came out without preamble, without the usual social softening. Direct. Like a man who has decided the time for indirect approaches is conclusively over. "I need you to be at the settlement meeting this afternoon," Elizabeth said. "As witness. Your capital is part of this financial picture, and you have a right to have it formally acknowledged in the settlement documentation, not as something Alexander addresses privately later." Edmund nodded. "Done. What else?" "I need your honest assessment of Presswick," she said. "The Philadelphia investor. Catherine has initiated contact. Howell thinks his interest is genuine. Do you know him?" "By reputation," Edmund said. "He's careful. He doesn't invest in dying things, he invests in things being badly managed that have good bones." He paused. "Which describes this estate accurately." "It has good bones," Elizabeth agreed. "Because of you," Edmund said. She looked at him. "I'm not flattering you," he said. "I'm being accurate. The eastern fields, the mill contract, the irrigation, those aren't improvements that happen on their own. Someone made decisions and worked them through, and that someone was you." He paused. "Presswick will want to know who's been managing the underlying assets. When he finds out it's been a woman working without authority for 6 years, he's either going to be impressed or he's going to be an idiot about it." "Most men are one or the other," Elizabeth said. Edmund almost laughed. "What do you want to happen with the estate?" he said. "After. When you're at the Whitmore house and Alexander is here and the settlement is signed, what do you actually want the estate to become?" It was the same question Catherine had asked her and Howell in his way, and Alexander himself. But coming from Edmund, it had a different weight, because Edmund was asking it not from guilt or obligation, but from genuine curiosity about what she would build if someone simply got out of her way. "I want it to survive," she said. "Not for Alexander's sake specifically, for the people who work it. The tenants, the farmhands, the household staff. They didn't make the decisions that put this place in debt, and they shouldn't pay for those decisions with their livelihoods." She paused. "And I want it in good enough condition that my child can someday choose what to do with their portion of it. Not inherit a problem. Inherit a choice." Edmund was quiet for a moment. "Alexander is going to need help," he said. "Real help. Not someone to manage for him the way you did. He needs to actually learn to manage it himself, or he'll be back in the same position in 5 years." "I know," Elizabeth said. "I'm going to stay," Edmund said. "For a while. If you have no objection, and I recognize that's an odd thing to ask given the circumstances, but you are the one who actually understands what needs doing here, so your objection matters more than Alexander's welcome." Elizabeth looked at him carefully. "You'd stay to help him learn to run the estate." "I'd stay to make sure my $20,000 produces something other than a debt payment," Edmund said. "But yes, that too." Something in Elizabeth's chest loosened, not completely, not without remainder, but enough that she noticed it. She had been holding the estate in her mind for 3 days, turning it over and over, trying to figure out how to leave it without leaving it entirely to its own destruction. She hadn't been able to solve it because the solution had required someone else to step into a role she was vacating, and she hadn't known who that person was. Edmund, she thought. It was Edmund. "Then stay," she said, "and start with the eastern fence line. Graves's accounting on the maintenance work is going to show that the fence repairs he claimed to have done weren't fully completed. You'll need to assess the actual state of it before we can give Presswick an honest inventory." Edmund blinked. "You want me to start with the fence line? I want you to start with the truth of what the estate actually is," she said. "The fence line is part of the truth. So is the mill wheel housing and the southfield drainage and the condition of the equipment barn, none of which Graves has given an accurate accounting of in at least 8 months. She paused. "Can you do that?" "Yes," Edmund said. And now there was something in his voice she hadn't expected, something that sounded like relief, which was interesting, because it was the relief of a man being handed a real problem to solve after too long being held at the edge of things. Good, Elizabeth said. Talk to Howell before the afternoon meeting. He'll want your account of the investment on record. She left him to it. The settlement meeting began at 2 o'clock. It went for 3 hours. Caldwell had revised the terms overnight, and the revision was considerably more honest than the original document, which told Elizabeth that Briggs had briefed him thoroughly, and that Caldwell, whatever his other qualities, was not a man who wanted to attach his name to something that would embarrass him later. Howell sat beside Elizabeth. Edmund sat at the end of the table. Catherine Harrington, who had not been invited to this meeting, and came anyway, sat to the left of her son with the specific authority of a woman who has decided that the phrase "not invited" does not apply to situations involving her family's future. Nobody told her to leave. The land reversion was agreed in 20 minutes. The child's provision took 40, primarily because Howell rewrote Clause 3 with the precision of a man who had spent 40 years closing the gaps that other men's vague language had opened, and Caldwell read every revision with the care of someone learning from it. The Graves matter was formally separated into its own proceeding. Alexander signed an acknowledgement that the estate owed Elizabeth restitution for the stolen funds as they had been taken during a period of her active management and from accounts she was responsible for. Caldwell proposed the language. Howell improved it. Elizabeth signed it without comment. Then they came to the management contribution documentation. This was the piece Elizabeth had needed most and explained least, and she had kept it that way deliberately, because she had learned over 6 years that explaining yourself in advance gave people time to construct objections, whereas presenting a finished fact gave them only the choice of accepting it or actively fighting it. She placed the document on the table. It was 4 pages. It listed in chronological order every decision she had made regarding the estate's management over 6 years, with dates, outcomes, and where applicable independent verification from third parties. The land assessors, the mill records, the Pendleton correspondence. It was signed at the bottom by Elizabeth, by Howell as her attorney, and by Briggs, who had spent the previous afternoon reviewing it against the estate's own records and confirming every figure. She slid it across the table to Caldwell. Caldwell read it. He read it the way he'd been reading things all morning, with the increasing expression of a man being educated against his will and finding the education despite himself accurate. He looked at Alexander. Alexander looked at the document. He had not seen it before this moment. She had not shown it to him deliberately, not from cruelty, but because she needed his reaction in this room to be genuine, witnessed, uncoached. "This is accurate," Alexander said. It wasn't a question. "Every figure," Briggs said quietly. "I'd like this entered into the settlement record," Elizabeth said. "Not as a financial claim, the financial claims are already addressed. As documentation of contribution. As a legal record that establishes my capability and my history of sound management, which I can present to any merchant bank or investor when establishing my independent enterprise." Caldwell looked at Howell. "This is unusual." "It's accurate and it's documented," Howell said. "The unusual quality of it reflects the unusual circumstances that produced it, not any deficiency in the request." Catherine spoke for the first time in the meeting. "Sign it, Mr. Caldwell." He signed it. Alexander signed it. Elizabeth watched Alexander's pen move across the bottom of that page, and she felt something she had not expected to feel. Not victory, not relief, not even satisfaction, but something quieter and more permanent than any of those. The feeling of a thing being made real that had always been real but had never been acknowledged. The feeling of a fact finally arriving at its own name. She signed it herself last. Howell witnessed it. The room was quiet for a moment after the final signature. Then Edmund said from his end of the table, "Is there anything else that needs signing today?" "No," Elizabeth said. "I think that's everything." She left Harrington Manor on a Thursday, 3 weeks after she had walked into the library and found the silver tray, not with a great departure. No assembled household, no formal farewell in the front hall. She had said her goodbyes over the previous days to Margaret, who had cried, which had undone Elizabeth more than almost anything else in the past 3 weeks, because Margaret was not a woman who cried easily. To Thomas, who had shaken her hand with the gravity of a man who understood exactly what he was acknowledging. to the cook, to the stable hands, and to the groundskeeper who had helped her redesign the garden 2 summers ago, and who had said simply, "You made this place better, ma'am," which was the most complete thing anyone had said to her. She took her writing desk. Her father's gift, the locked one now containing the signed settlement documents and the management contribution record and the child's provision framework. She took her account books. She took her personal correspondence. She took 3 dresses and left 4 because she was going to a smaller house, and she had never in her life been a woman who needed 4 dresses to feel like herself. She did not take the portrait of herself that hung in the east hallway. A painting Alexander had commissioned in the 2nd year of their marriage, stiff and formal, and not particularly like her. She had never liked it. She did take from the garden a cutting of the climbing rose that grew along the south wall. She had planted it the first spring of their marriage from a cutting her mother had given her, and it had grown without particular attention into something sprawling and permanent that bloomed every June in a color that was almost exactly the color of the Virginia clay soil at certain hours of the afternoon. She wrapped the cutting in damp cloth and set it carefully in the carriage. Alexander came out to see her off. He stood at the top of the front steps, not blocking, not performing, just present. He looked like a man who had arrived somewhat late at the understanding that some losses are the direct consequence of choices that seemed at the time like the easiest path available. "Edmund is going to start on the fence line today," he said. "Good," Elizabeth said. "The south section first. And have him check the mill wheel housing. I left notes about the bearing on the east wheel in the maintenance file." "I'll tell him." She looked at him. "The child's appointment with Dr. Marsh is in 6 weeks, she said. "I'll send word after." "I'd like to know," he said. "Whatever, I'd like to be kept informed." "You will be." He came down 2 steps. He stopped there, which was the closest he'd come to her in 3 weeks with anything other than a document between them, and he looked at her the way she'd been looked at twice now by people who had finally seen her, really seen her, and found the looking to be more than they'd anticipated. "I reckon," he said, and the word came out plain and unpolished the way words do when a man has stopped reaching for the right-sounding version of a thing and is just saying the actual thing, "that I had a great deal more than I knew and considerably less sense than I needed." Elizabeth looked at him. "Yes," she said. "You did." He nodded once. He stepped back. And she got into the carriage, and the driver clicked to the horses, and Harrington Manor moved behind her. The way all the things you've outgrown eventually move. Not with drama, not with the satisfaction of a door slamming, but with the quiet, final, irrevocable movement of a life finding its actual shape. The Whitmore house smelled of summer and dust, and the particular stillness of a building that has been waiting. Elizabeth walked through every room. She opened windows. She assessed what needed repair. The kitchen pump, the upstairs hallway floorboard, the latch on the back door. She made a list, not because she needed to write it down to remember it, but because making a list was how she marked the beginning of things. Her father had taught her that. A list is a commitment, he'd said. You write down what you mean to do, and then you do it, and then you cross it off, and that's what a life is. A long list of things you committed to and followed through on. She pinned the list to the kitchen wall. Then she sat down at her father's table, the big one, the one that had seated 8 when the whole family came for Sunday dinner, the one she'd done her lessons on as a girl, and she spread out the papers for the Presswick meeting. Edmund had confirmed that morning that Alderman Presswick would arrive in Virginia within the fortnight. Catherine had spoken with him directly in the plain and thorough way. Catherine spoke with everyone, and he had agreed that the estate's underlying assets properly assessed and managed represented a sound investment. He wanted a full accounting. He wanted to understand the management structure going forward. He had not, according to Catherine's letter, been an idiot about Elizabeth. He had been impressed. She read the letter twice. She thought about what Edmund had said, that Presswick invested in things being badly managed that had good bones. She thought about what it would mean for those bones to finally fully be managed well. Not by a woman working without authority, in the margins of someone else's enterprise. By her directly with her name on the documents, and her signature on the contracts, and her record fully established in legal writing for anyone who wished to question it. She thought about what she would build here on her own land. Not just the farming, though the farming would be good. She had plans for the soil rotation that she'd never been able to implement at full scale. A proper school eventually for the children of the tenant families on her land. She'd been thinking about it for a year. There was no school within 6 miles, which meant the children who could least afford to lose time to travel were the ones losing it. She had the space. She had the resources. She had now the unencumbered time and authority to make it happen. She pressed her hand flat on the table. The wood was solid under her palm. Old, sturdy, honestly made, her father's table. She thought about her child growing up in this house, learning at this table, running in these fields, growing up with both history and the knowledge of how much it was possible to build with your own 2 hands and your own clear eyes, and the refusal, the absolute bedrock, non-negotiable refusal to become less than what you knew yourself to be. Her eyes stung. She let them. She sat at her father's table in the late afternoon of a Virginia summer, and she let herself feel the full weight of the last 3 years. The management and the silence and the exhaustion and the loneliness of carrying something enormous in a space too small for it. And then she let it move through her, the way she'd let the anger move through her when she found out about Graves all the way through, until what was left was not grief or bitterness, but something that felt unexpectedly almost like peace. Almost. Peace would come. She was certain of that, the way she was certain of soil assessments and account figures. Not because she wished it, but because she had looked at the evidence, and the evidence supported it. She wiped her eyes. She picked up her pen. She began to write. 6 months later, when the first frost of winter came to Virginia, and the tobacco fields had been harvested, and the Mercer debt had been settled through Presswick's investment and Edmund's reorganized management, and Catherine's iron-willed insistence that every party involved behave like an adult. 6 months later, Elizabeth Whitmore sat in the parlor of her own house with a letter in her hand, and her son 3 weeks old in the cradle her father had made for her when she was born. The letter was from Alexander. It was not long. He had learned over the fall to be less long-winded because Elizabeth had gently and consistently not responded to the long-winded parts of things, and he was a man who, when given accurate feedback and sufficient motivation, could learn. He wrote that the fall harvest had come in at 91% of the projected yield, which was the best the estate had seen in 4 years, which Elizabeth already knew because Edmund had told her. He wrote that the new foreman, a man named Tate, who had come recommended by the Pendleton family and whose account books were, Edmund confirmed so clean they were almost boring, had proposed a spring schedule that closely resembled the rotation Elizabeth had implemented on her own land the previous year. He wrote that the east fence line was fully repaired. He wrote that the east hallway was different now. He had taken down the stiff, formal portrait that Elizabeth had never liked. In its place, because the wall looked bare, and because Edmund had suggested it, he had commissioned a painting of the 300 acres from the western rise. The view Elizabeth had looked at from her bedroom window on 100 difficult mornings, the fields in their full summer color, the tree line beyond them, the sky over it all. He said he thought it was a truer record of what the estate was than any portrait of a person. He wrote at the bottom in handwriting that was a little less careful than the rest, as if it had been added after "I would like to meet him when you are ready, and when it suits you. I will not press. I only wanted you to know I would like to." Elizabeth read the letter twice. Then she looked at her son, who was 3 weeks old, and therefore not yet capable of opinions about anything, but who had. She had already determined an expression in his sleep that was entirely his own, neither hers nor Alexander's, but his, which seemed right, which seemed like the best possible beginning. "Your father," she said to him quietly, conversationally, the way she talked to him about everything, because she had decided early that there was no reason to wait until he could respond to begin the conversation, "is going to be a better man than he was. He is working at it." She paused. "He has good people around him who will not let him stop." Her son slept. She folded the letter and set it on the table beside the cradle. She stood and stretched and went to the window, and outside the Whitmore fields ran out under the winter sky, in their long, clean lines, rested, properly managed, ready for spring. She had done that. Her land, her hands, her knowledge, her refusal to be reduced to less than what she was. She thought about that day in the library, the silver tray, the papers, the pen with its cap removed. The way the whole scene had been arranged to tell her that she had already lost before she'd even entered the room. She had walked in anyway. She had sat in his chair. She had said, "I am not finished," and she hadn't been. She pressed her hand to the cold glass of the window and looked out at her land. And she thought, This is what it looks like. Not the end of something. Not the survival of something. The beginning of something that had always been there waiting inside her like a seed in good soil, needing only the space to grow, without someone else's shadow falling across it. She had not cried when they brought her those papers. She had not signed when they laid them before her. She had not shrunk when they counted on her falling apart. And standing now in the house, her father built on the land that was hers, carrying the future of a child who would grow up knowing exactly who his mother was, and exactly what she had built, and exactly what it cost, and exactly what it was worth. Elizabeth Whitmore understood with the complete and quiet certainty of a woman who has finally arrived at the life she was always capable of living. That the day Alexander Harrington thought he was ending her story was the day she had finally begun to write it, and she had